Howdy folks, and welcome back to the channel. I have a grenade, but it's not just any grenade. See, this one's kind of a tactical Easter egg. This grenade holds candy. Now, I made this because I needed grenades for my ODST cosplay, and I was far too cheap to buy toy grenades to use as a prop. So I wondered if I could make one using stuff that I had laying around. Turns out I could, so I did. The process was so easy, I actually made 4 of these grenades with various styles and differences between them. I used very cheap materials like medicine bottles and foam floor mats, and I'm going to show you how I did it. So I made a couple of frag grenades and one that is more of a smoke or flashbang style. And again, I used a fat medicine bottle like this one. So let's get right into it. We take our lid and glue it to the bottom of the medicine bottle, and take the smaller lid and glue it to the top of the medicine bottle. With our base created, it's time to make a template for the top piece. I trace out the edges of the medicine bottle, and then begin sketching out my template. I refine the template using a ruler and a marker, and then go ahead and cut the template out. Next, we need to make a template for the piece that goes on the side of the grenade. I have always heard it called a spoon, but apparently it's called a safety lever. Whatever you want to call it. I trace out our original template and then draft up this design for the spoon/safety lever. And it looks pretty good. And we'll be making our pieces in EVA foam floor mats. I got these at Harbor Freight. I trace out the template, however, the back side of this foam is textured, so we need to flip the template to make sure that when we put them together, we have both smooth sides facing out and not a textured side. Now, using a box cutter, I cut our pieces out of EVA foam, and I'm going to switch knives here to get some of the details. This is a Fiskars brand finger knife, and it's good for getting some of those harder to reach sections. I use the Fiskars again for the bottom pieces and switch back to the box cutter to cut the rest of the pieces out. Now I want you to pay attention to how I use the hot glue gun here. A lot of people have issues using hot glue, and I think it's because they're not using it right. As you see, I put a lot on there and then I smooth the glue around to make sure that it will cover the whole area that needs to be covered. A lot of people just put one little line of glue and stick it together and hope for the best. Now, what I mentioned before about the textured side, that has happened on our spoon piece. So we need to make a new template that we're going to cut out of very thin foam, which will be glued on top of the texture side in order to cover it. This foam is about 2 mm thick. It is craft foam, and you can get it at most arts and crafts stores. And we do a test fit to make sure we're good. And we're going to do one more piece because the spoon/safety lever is pretty bendy. So I'm using a material called Sintra plastic. It's pretty thin, you can cut it with a pair of scissors, but it will add a little bit more rigidity to our build. So after cutting out the Sintra pieces for either side, we glue them in place, and using a rotary tool we sand them down because I cut them a little bit too big. Next, I want our top piece to have a little bit more of an angle. So holding the blade at an angle, I cut inwards, and this is a really fun technique that gives us these nice little angled/beveled edges without having to use a rotary tool to achieve it. Now, if you want to use a rotary tool, that's fine, because I understand that it's a little dubious cutting towards your fingers like that. Now, taking another strip of thin foam, I make this little cover piece in order to kind of hide the seams. And similar to what we just did, I cut out another long rectangular strip. This is going to go on the very top in order to cover up the seams. After measuring and cutting it, we go ahead and hot glue it into place. And now we're going to make a piece to cover up the sides of our top section. Using the original template from before, I make two pieces, and I'm going to cut these a little bit smaller because we have those beveled edges. So I hold it against the top section, mark off where the bevels are at, and cut the piece to fit. Now we hot glue it into place, and we'll do this to both sides. With that done, it's time to add some details to our top section. I'm using a thicker foam, not as thick as the foam floor mats. Foam floor mats are about 10 millimeter or half an inch thick. This is around 6 to 5 millimeters, somewhere around there. I cut out a little rectangle, bevel the edges, and then I'm going to hot glue this on top of our piece. This is the section that was red on the grenades I showed you earlier. Real grenades don't have this, but I always like to add a little extra something to my builds to make them a little more sci-fi. Next up, using a drill attachment for my rotary tool, I bore out some holes on the sides of the grenade top piece thingy. Really need a better name for this. I like adding hardware to my builds to make them look a little more authentic even when they are on the more sci-fi side. So I'm using Chicago screws and running them into the foam and then capping them on either side. Except for the front piece, I did not have a long enough Chicago screw for the front, so I'm just going to hot glue some shorter Chicago screws in place. This makes it look like it's actually metal and has rivets holding it together. With all that done, we can finally attach the top to the body of the grenade. And next up, we're going to modify the medicine bottle slightly. There's a tab you have to press down to open it, so I take a pair of wire cutters and cut that tab off so that we can screw and unscrew the lid easier. Now I measure out the width of the body of the medicine bottle, and I cut a long rectangular strip out of foam. This we will wrap around the bottle, and it will serve as the base for our fragmentation parts of the grenade. I cut it to fit, wrap it around, and make sure that it does in fact fit. And I measure and mark the halfway point of the rectangle, and I start to cut it before I realize that I have not marked out the individual segments that we're going to need. So I stop and I mark off 1-inch segments and then go back to cutting. Now I bevel the edges on both of our new strips. And you can see what I mean here, that you are cutting very close to your fingers, so this is not a beginner technique. I'd recommend practicing this a few times, but it does give you really nice cuts once you figure out how to do it. A really sharp blade is definitely key. Now we cut all of our 1-inch segments, and they're only beveled on the top and bottom, so now we're going to cut and bevel the sides. This gives us a sort of square pyramid type shape that we will use as the fragmentation parts of the grenade. Now I proceed to do this about 20 more times, and then we can finally start gluing these bad boys onto the grenade body. With all the pieces glued in place, we can test fit the top and see what we've got. I'd say that looks like a grenade. Well, almost. It still needs a pin. So I have a box of cotter pins and some key rings. I got the cotter pins from Harbor Freight for like $3 or $4, and the key rings were like $5 on Amazon. I just push the cotter pin into the foam, and now we have a grenade with a pull pin. With the build portion of the grenade complete, it's time to move on to paint. I'm using Flex Seal Black. Typically, I would use Plasti-Dip. They are both a rubber spray paint. However, Flex Seal leaves a little bit of a texture, which is not always ideal. However, in this case, that hammered metal texture that it leaves will actually be quite beneficial. Next up for color, I'm using Krylon Farm Implement High Gloss Tractor Green. And I'm trying to just spray the bottom, and I'm not very successful at it. I'm getting paint all over the other parts of it, but that's fine. We'll paint those sections later. Now we move inside to the paint table. I'm using Apple Barrel Black. This is going to be our base for a black wash, which is just adding water into the paint. You can add other stuff into it, but I typically just water down the paint, slather it all over whatever I'm doing, and then wipe away the paint with a towel. This will cause the black paint to seep into the cracks and crevices and gives it a little more definition and contrast. Now with the bottom part done, I move on to doing the top. And I do the top mostly out of frame of the camera, but it's alright, you can see the finished product here. And we put it together, check how it looks. And moving back to our black paint, I'm going to paint the spoon/safety lever, or whatever you want to call it, along with the top section of the grenade solid black. With that done, we move on to our Delta Ceramacoat. Ceramacoat, I'm not sure how you say it, but the color is Black Pearl, and I'm going to use that dry brushed onto here to give it a little bit more of a texture. This will really highlight those bumps and grooves that the Flex Seal leaves behind. You can see that texture here. Gives it a sort of hammered metal kind of look. Next up, I'm using Brushed Metal, Brushed Pale Silver from Folk Art. We're using a large brush, and I'm going to dry brush that on the edges to just give it a little bit more of a worn look. Real grenade probably wouldn't have a whole bunch of weathering and stuff on it like this, but nonetheless, I like to have a consistent style, and the style that I do is very well used, beat up, and worn. With our silver done, we move on to Apple Barrel Flamenco Red. And I'm using this on the top, just for that little rectangle piece that we did earlier. Now with the red out of the way, I want to add some weathering to the black. So I'm using a chrome paint pen marker and just going around the edges or anything raised up where I feel like the paint would have gotten kind of scraped off of it. It's not a perfect science, I just kind of do whatever feels right with it. And this is our finished, well, almost finished result. It's still very glossy, almost as if we used high gloss tractor green. So we're going to use Rust-Oleum Matte Clear Enamel in order to take away some of that gloss. And after our gloss coat dries, here is our finished product. I would say that looks convincing enough like a grenade to be used for cosplay purposes. So, thank you for sticking with me to the end here. And if you enjoyed it, drop a like and subscribe. And I hope to see you in the next one.